I think if you go just mental on this whole thing, I mean, I don't really think you're going to turn around, big governments, and I don't think we're going to, all the stuff that's happening, at the COP25 meeting and everything. I don't have a lot of faith in it.
Right.
But I have faith in something else, and maybe the faith in them together. But I don't think the straight and narrow view of cause and effect is going to do it here. And that's part of the reason that we need different ways of perceiving. Now the big transition, I feel like all that was cutting my teeth for the huge transition that we're all in, that no one can escape. I've lived with a constant awareness that there's the outer and then there's the inner, and that they're related, and that so I listen to the news, I watch the trends, I look at what's going on, and I am also tuned to how that's taking place internally. And I look at the link between the two. And that's the part about how then shall we live. Because how we think, how we manage ourselves, how we manage our relationships, how we make decisions, how we work with our heart, these all relate to the changing shape of things.
Well, Barbara, one of the things that I'd love to do in just beginning this podcast or this conversation, this post-doom conversation, is to invite you to share, whatever comes to mind for you. These are the questions I've been asking my other guests as well. And I know that you and I have co-hosted several, so you know these questions, but I'd love to hear your response to, what language do you find yourself using for these times? How does post-doom as a meme, as a word, ring for you? Just anything you want to say about the language of this.
Post-doom feels oversimplified to me. I think there's a direction that we're moving that doesn't have a far side, that it's a waving process of incremental change requiring constant adjustment, adaptation, refreshed response.
Just a quick reminder, I'm not using doom in the way that it's synonymous with collapse. One is outer, one is inner. So post-collapse would be sort of after the external events or whatever. Post-doom is simply, what I'm trying to point to is the emotional state of like ugh or oh shit or whatever that people get when we're not on perpetual progress. And then working through whatever grief, anger, depression, whatever we need to move through. And then that whole universe or the whole space that opens up on the other side of what Paul Tversky calls finding the gift. So that's what I'm meaning by post-doom, is that emotional space, the inner space of getting beyond mere acceptance of what's inevitable and then finding this, whatever it is. I don't want to give language to it because I don't want to put my worldview out there for you, but I'm looking at the inner stuff is what I'm trying to focus on in terms of post-doom.
Thank you for that clear distinction. And I don't even see that as a line where you get over it. I see it that just as the outer thing has iterations, so too does the inner thing. So that I would say there's a constant deepening and more understanding and more rearrangement that comes relative to the collapse. And that is an ongoing process. So I'm very thankful for this time of year and the dark and the quiet, in the pause to calibrate relative to where we are now.
Yeah, that's great. Barbara, I'm curious, as you know, this series, what I'm really inviting various guests, activists, authors, people who have been tracking this for some time and who have been also contributing to supporting others in dealing with whatever is coming up for them, as you have. In fact, I'll just mention it here for anybody that didn't hear me mention this in other conversations, that you and Dar, your Truthout posts on How Then Shall We Live, was one of the main inspirations for this series in the first place. It was Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper, and then his other writings after that, and interviews. Catherine Ingram's Facing Extinction long form essay, yours and Dar's Truthout essays, and Paul Chafurka's writings on his Approaching the Limits website. The four of you all have been in the process of staying present to what's real, articulating it very powerfully, as Dar has been doing in his dispatches, but then also going that next step and looking deeply and expressing your own vulnerability in terms of emotionally processing all this. So I want to allow you, just to invite you to take as long as you want to share your story, your journey, your trajectory, but basically what was your worldview like growing up, and how did you come to understanding climate and just all the large scale issues that we're now dealing with?
For as long as can remember in my life, I've been a middle child. I've been a kind of caught between different factions. I've been a bridging person. I'm a double Libra. I'm sort of tarred with that brush of listening. And somehow my going to graduate school and all the work that I did in my early years had to do with helping people find a deeper potential that existed in their relationships, personally or in groups or in organizations. I was an organizational development specialist with a focus on leadership. And I found myself always helping people move through transitions. As times changed, as cycles changed, there was need to shift personally and relative to things external, to help them adjust, to be more in tune with the times. And, it used to be more effective or profitable or satisfying, although those things don't interest me so much anymore. Now the big transition, I feel like all that was cutting my teeth for the huge transition that we're all in, that no one can escape.
Yeah.
My understanding of my own examined life relative to transitions and my own work as coach and running an organization, an international organization for women, where we've assisted women from 19 different countries to learn to lead their lives in a more grounded, rooted, genuine, authentic way as they hit thresholds and points at which business as usual in their own lives no longer serves. Mm-hmm. So somehow I've landed here with the big one. I've lived with a constant awareness that there's the outer and then there's the inner, and that they're related, and that so I listen to the news, I watch the trends, I look at what's going on, and I am also tuned to how that's taking place internally. And I look at the link between the two. And that's the part about How Then Shall We Live. Mm-hmm. Because how we think, how we manage ourselves, how we manage our relationships, how we make decisions, how we work with our heart, these all relate to the changing shape of things, not just to help us situate in a more safe or secure way, but I feel those in the internal placement also has it's a form of activism that has the fulcrum that lives very close to home has its effects that may not easily be measured external to ourselves. There's a lot of kinds of activism, and I really appreciate what everybody's doing. And in mine, there's always an inner aspect.
Say a little bit more about that, if you would, because what we're hoping for in this series, this post-Doom conversation series, is it seems to me that every season there'll be several million more people that have moved beyond either denial or functional denial, which is actually pretty normal and healthy and natural, but to the place where they're genuinely looking for mentors, they're looking for sources of nourishment, sources of sustenance, sources of help in terms of how to deal with their own relating of their inner process and their outer process. So any specificity that you can give would be useful to anybody watching or listening to this.
Okay, well, if you want, I'm going to go for the big one that's present in my awareness and in my observations.
Please.
And I haven't said this out loud before, so it's kind of an edge for me putting all this together. So pardon the sloppiness.
Okay.
But I think that's part of it, is being willing to go to the edge.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about the big trends that are happening right now, and the ones that there are many, but the ones that came to mind most recently are the movement towards totalitarianism. And there are examples of things that are running counter to that. There's always there's always this, but that's a huge thing going on in the world. Definitely the desecration of the earth and the intensification of that our headlong rush into an unlivable earth is inescapable for anyone on the planet right now. The other one that came to me just recently as I've been watching has to do with the subjugation of women and the violence towards women. I've worked for 20 years with women and helping them find their voice and meaning, purpose, calling, and leadership. And I have, interestingly enough, never called myself a feminist, and I've always been careful to say that the feminine belonged to men and women because I didn't want to alienate, and I do believe that. Mm-hmm. But I am seeing something else now that's coming into clear focus for me. I reread an article the other day about something that happened in India on January 1st of this past year, 2019, where there was a shoulder-to-shoulder chain for almost 400 miles of 5 million women across India. And that was a protest against violence and exclusion of women. That is no small thing. And then another thing that just happened was reported by the BBC November 26th on what was designated the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women. And they were talking about femicide, and that was a new word to me. It was a photo story that the BBC did, and it was women from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, France, Switzerland, Spain, Istanbul, Belgium, Sudan, and the US and Canada. And it has to do with women who are being murdered and violated. There is something going on here that's been around for a long time, and I want to name it. And the fourth trend that I would name does relate to this, and that is the genocide that's taking place towards Indigenous people, particularly like in the rainforest areas for the sake of oil and progress. And in North America, these two, the femicide crosses over with the Indigenous thing in an unbelievable phenomenon of missing and murdered of Indigenous women. I mean, that's pretty grim, everything that I've just said. I'm going big here. That's outer. Those are trends.
Yeah.
What, is there a name for this? Do all these things relate to one another? Yes, they do. In the Cree language, there is a word called wetiko. And I just want to say this, it's the sickness of exploitation, consuming another's life force for one's own purpose and
Yeah.
profit.
Yeah.
So it's like a disease.
Yes.
And the same disease is powering all this stuff. So we live in a diseased world, and our own experience is diseased because we've grown up in the atmosphere and the values and the assumptions that have caused a lot of this, especially for white people like me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking at, as a woman, how does the feminine relate to all of this? And there's something very close to the bone, which begins to provide a different force field, certainly personally and possibly collectively. And it relates to very deep regard and implication of what I would call the feminine, and a different starting place that is needed. And so my question is, how do I do that? And beyond that, how do I support that in both men and women on beyond myself? But that's that inner and outer thing again for me. You cannot look at the earth without looking at her long-term guardians who live by her law and are one and the same.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And to my mind, again, should any humans survive this bottleneck, there is no way to live sustainably. There is no way to live in a non-self-destructive way other than the way that Indigenous peoples, First Peoples, tribal peoples, people who love the land as a greater thou, not a lesser it. And these are our teachers. And what's occurring to me fresh in this conversation is that the resistance movements against totalitarianism, the resistance movements against the further rape of the planet and the further desecration of the sacred living biosphere, the resistance to the evil perpetrated against women, and the resistance that Indigenous peoples are largely leading in many cases to all of these. Maybe some of the most holy work, if not the most holy work, but resistance itself is, I'm seeing it increasingly as a necessary thing for me to be more engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, please continue.
So this morning I was thinking about kidney stones.
Okay.
Because I am looking for some different models to either undergird these movements and the resistance, as you're calling it, or to complement it in some particular way. And so I got into this inquiry about, okay, I know that one of the ways that you get rid of kidney stones is they blast them with a sonar thing. It's sound, this large, wide spectrum thing that cracks up the stone. Then I got to thinking about the stories I read about Ella Fitzgerald, that she was asked by Memorex, which had these new great speakers, to see if she could actually do that thing where you break a glass with your voice. And they amplified the voice through the Memorex speakers, and she broke the glass because the vibration was loud enough to break up the glass. And what I'm noticing, that a lot of the resistance isn't working. And I keep looking for the other, some other. And that's how I'm getting into this more deeper feminine force that can augment, back up what traditional resistance looks like, which is good for those who are resisting, and is highly needed, and is not enough because the ship is not turning.
I don't think any of the resistance movements of those are going to be effective. The only thing that they're doing, in my opinion, is they're nurturing the souls of those engaged in them. They are confronting what is in fact evil, and they are planting seeds that, should any humans survive in pockets of humanity post collapse of industrialism, post extinction of Homo colossus, that the seeds are planted so that humanity, the prodigal species, can come home to reality, to life, to God, G-O-D-D-E. That is the living ecosphere as divine. But I'd love to hear more about what you're sort of leaning into or intuiting into.
So I'm going to say something that may sound really naive, really simplistic, but it's hitting home to me at the moment, and I'm very happy for a conversation with others who can fill in a lot of the blanks that are present in my thinking. But if you say that glass that Ella Fitzgerald broke was our system, our system that has cracks in it. It's a lot easier to break a glass that has cracks in it, by the way, and all the research that I've done about this. And we have cracks all over the place in our developed Western systems. And so where does that amplified vibration come from that can either, break up a kidney stone or, explode a glass?
Mm-hmm.
And that's very close to home. That does honor the deep, that honor Gaia, or God as you're calling it, G-O-D-D-E, that lives deep within us. So that for me is that is the amplification. That's the Memorex system. That is the amplification of an alternative vibration, lifestyle values, if you want to look at it that way. But it is it's an energy, and its source is very close to home. Where in the most intimate sense is this source of the feminine energetic? And I think there's a lot of ways to get to it, but the three of them came to me today. One of them is very, very deep listening for interior impulse.
Okay.
That there is a guidance system that lives within each one of us. And when we build the conditions for listening and the muscle and courage for following what we hear, there is a source for us that tells us how to be in these times. It tells us what's our piece in the thing, rather than just following another leader. But it's an interior connection. And for me, when someone lives from that place, there's gravitas, there's weight to their living, there's elder quality, I don't care how old they are, and there's a force field around them, and whatever they decide to do carries more weight than someone who is not sourced at this level.
Yes, yeah.
The second thing is right placement. And this is, for me, also part of in tune with the ultimate, universal design. And that sounds very lofty, and bringing it right down to terms is our relationship to other people. And, some people, they call this boundaries, and you go to Al-Anon to figure out what that is so that you can be more, healthy, and all that I love. But when you get a solar system where everything's in its right place, the right distance from each other, the whole works. And the right distance so that the maximum amount of creativity and flow can be born out of these fields.
Mm.
And these fields are where the new world is born. They are it is the field of the feminine. It is creation herself, and it needs the field of our connections done meticulously.
Mm.
And that
Mhm.
means cleaning up a lot of wounds, because we
Mhm.
usually place ourselves and sustain ourselves where they are because of things that we need, because stuff that happened that was shitty in our childhood. So I'm all for, getting this cleaned up so we can get going here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's the second thing.
Mhm.
And then the other one is attention paid and respect paid to cycles,
Yes.
because we are so out of sync with a natural cycles of birth and death at
Mhm.
just literal big levels. We don't know how to do endings. We don't know how to stop doing things that need to be stopped, that are no longer serving us or anybody else. We don't know when to listen for the next thing. We don't know how to do beginnings that are born out of silence. Our mind is so busy because it can't stand not being employed, thinking up the next thing that would be good to do and doing it as fast as possible. And especially as it relates to fixing this whole bloody climate situation, very close in our own lives. So getting in sync, even though it may seem like you're doing nothing. I don't think there's in North America much that you can do right now in these weeks until the solstice that actually has viability and roots and power, because things are not initiating right now. So if you think you're initiating something, listen once, twice, three times to see where that's coming from. So if you tune into the natural cycle of things, something may build that can show up in a few months from now, if you're patient and not superimposing your need to be meaningful and engaged and employed right off the bat. So that's the cycle. So all of these things are deep feminine sensitivities. They live in men and women. And if we are sourced by them, there is a power and influence through the things that we choose to do. And on top of that, the collective piece, that this is the Memorex piece, the
Mhm.
amplification on Ella Fitzgerald's voice.
Mhm.
When there are enough people doing this, it's the intensification of that source and that energy that can actually break up these foul, devastating, murderous systems that are dominating the
Mm.
planet right now.
Mm.
And I pay deep respect to Native communities that's why they've sustained themselves for 15,000 years in harmony, because of where they sourced themselves from. Okay,
Yes.
that was a big lecture, but there you go.
Wow, that was just kick-ass Buddhist. Really, I mean, I'm so grateful that you went into that with the passion that you did, because it's exactly in alignment with what I'm hoping for in this series, is to, invite guests to really share what's fresh, what's up in terms of their worldview, understanding their heart, their passion in this. And the way you articulated both the sort of the four trends, and then these, what would you call these three that you just articulated?
Are ways to attune to the deep feminine creative universal force, which is the very thing that has been squished, and we need to reconnect with personally and together, so that we serve that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that you're using the word feminine, I'm noticing every time you've done so, I think to myself, well, that's what I'm meaning by divine. Because divine is all about the whole. It's about the well-being of the whole. It's about honoring limits. It's about, there are healthy ways of being masculine that have been so lost in colonizing really anthropocentric cultures. It seems to me that once we domesticated, quote unquote, the living world, plants and animals, and entered into a more mastery relationship rather than a mutually enhancing relationship, that we see the masculine dimension of things not being healthfully expressed as they are in pro-future cultures, but in a rather dysfunctional way as they are in most anti-future cultures. And so your use of feminine and my use of the word divine, I'm noticing just in terms of my own sort of worldview, is very, very similar. It's embodied, it's incarnate, it's living, it's respectful,
It's practical, it's courageous, it's passionate,
mm-hmm.
it's respectful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yes. Wow. That was so great. Well, Barbara, there's a question that I've been asking some of the other guests in this series as the last question, but I feel led to invite you to respond to it in the context of what you just shared these last 10 or 15, 20 minutes. And that is related to what is your sense of what's still possible and what is beyond our control or no longer possible, both at the inner level and also in terms of the outer world.
I remain in the don't know camp.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wary of those who are so sure that they know, because of this category of the other. There are many influences that our brains cannot comprehend. And the kind of deep listening and openness and abiding in directives that come from a deeply sourced place accesses that other.
Yeah.
And I think if you go just mental on this whole thing, I mean, I don't really think you're going to turn around, big governments, and I don't think we're going to, all the stuff that's happening, at the COP25 meeting and everything. I don't have a lot of faith in it.
Right.
But I have faith in something else, and maybe the faith in them together. But I don't think the straight and narrow view of cause and effect is going to do it here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason that we need different ways of perceiving. There's been a lot of mental arrogance, and that obviates the other. And
Yeah.
I'm very, very interested in making space for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. And so I want to go to two other questions that I would love to hear you respond to from this place that you've been articulating. And that is one related to the overarching great story, big picture, epic of evolution, like the large narrative of physical evolution, biological evolution, cultural evolution as one evidence-based modern day creation myth. And how has that story in some way been helpful to you in coming to terms with all this and in the work that you do? And then the other question relating to impermanence and death. So let's take the first one. Has the universe story or epic of evolution been something that has been nurturing or supportive to you in this process, or is it just something that you don't think a whole lot about?
I don't think a whole lot about it. But the one thing I would say is I think that I do believe that we're in an aberration, not a rightful evolutionary healthy process.
Yes.
That we have distorted and destroyed something which naturally blossoms.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. The second question relates to impermanence and death. That, for example, myself, by holding impermanence and death as a sacred aspect of the nature of reality, the reality of the universe that we live in, the nature of our own nature, and by being genuinely at peace with my own mortality and being at peace with our species' mortality, recognizing that whether we last another 50 years or 5 million years, we're going to go extinct at some point. And even 5 million years from now, that's on a cosmic timeline, is not very long. And so I'm wondering how you think about impermanence and death, and is there a way that you hold the realities of impermanence and death, mortality, that are spiritually or emotionally helpful to you?
Well, this is it's one and the same as my interest in attunement to natural cycles.
Of course,
And
yes.
that comes in very close. So it's natural.
Yeah.
And coming back to earth, coming back to natural cycles, puts us in touch with natural cycles of life and death.
Yes.
And there are a million opportunities with how we deal with death in our families, how we deal with illness in ourselves, how we deal with the passing of a dog, but how we deal with becoming an empty nester as your child leaves and that whole portion of your life is over. How you deal with a divorce, something that's over. It's, for me, this is you're asking it in great cosmic terms, and I'm bringing it very close to home.
Yes.
I took a walk this morning and just was so intensely moved by the way the light came through the cedar trees. My appreciation and reverence for life is as it's never been before.
Yeah.
I have very good friends that live in Australia, New South Wales.
Mhm.
And the fires burning there are almost more than the mind can take. And my heart breaks. And I hold them. I hold them daily in prayer, in awareness, in love.
Yeah.
Those are practices that all kinds of new practices that need to come into place.
Mm-hmm. Or repurposing and reviving, restoring, regenerating practices that perhaps has been a part of our past or our the past of our traditions, and then brought into this new context.
I have an elder friend. Her name is Ann Dozier, and Ann is into her 90s and she's not well now, but she was a pipe carrier and with a very long tradition of ceremony, and along with her community of fellow women pipe carriers, she had her own practices, and every day she, regardless of the weather, took off her shoes and went into her backyard, and she held the world in her pipe. She bowed to the ancestors in all the directions and to Father Sky, the star people, and Mother Earth. And she named out loud the people, the circumstances, the aspects of Earth which needed to be held in the pipe. I am not a pipe carrier, but there is a bowl in me that holds. And I know how to create a sacred atmosphere and how to hold things in that and how to trust spirit to have its way, to do things that the human mind could never begin to fix or care for. How to give these things over to the Spirit and to trust is the practice of my life now. Thank you.
I think that's probably the note we'll end on.